Welcome to our introductory webinar on experiments in integrative leadership. In our 30 minutes today, we're going to dive into what exactly is integrative leadership and why does it matter? We'll share a little bit of the hypothesis behind this work and the foundations of it. And then we'll link it all together by showing you formulas and measurement you can use to identify where you and other leaders are on this integrative leadership model. And we'll close out with an invitation to join us in this ongoing experiment. So, who am I? I'm Gretchen Griffin. I'm a human catalyst. What exactly is that? That is an evolutionary spark that ignites possibility. And what's possible right now is humanizing the workplace for generations we'll never meet. I am dedicated to championing and challenging leaders to do that. It is my life's work and it is my honor to do that. Speaking of my honor, I am not alone in this work. Mark and I have been working on this for the last couple of years. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Gretchen. So, Mark Yoel, I've labeled myself as a pragmatic utopian, which in itself is a contradiction in terms or a polarity to be integrated. Utopian because I've always had my heart lifted by the vision of what's possible in a thriving world, a thriving self, and a thriving community, and a thriving planet. And pragmatic because being a Capricorn, my feet are firmly on the ground. And so, how do we actually take pragmatic steps to achieve that vision? Particularly, I'm interested now in supporting leaders who are committed to being the best for the world rather than being the best in the world. So, this is people who are interested in service to the world rather than ambition for themselves. And that's where my focus is as we go forward. Imagine, if you will, a black and white photograph that is full of smog and a little bit blurry. And the photograph is of a pair of adult hands holding the planet, holding a globe, handing it over to a pair of young hands. And in some sense, that picture, if you can just picture that, is what we have that is going to happen if we don't wake up and take care of what we're doing right now. So imagine that same picture, though, that's clear, full of color, of greens and blues and sunshine, and it's vibrant and alive. And what we're handing over to those young hands is something that will be a pleasure for them to live on. That, for me, is what encapsulates what we hear about creating a world that works for the next generation. And we need to act now because later is too late.
Yeah, it's true. It's like it begins with us, and it begins with us as leaders. And leadership isn't easy, and we all have a role to play in this. So let's take a little bit of a time travel to the past. In the past, the call for leaders was really around profits and productivity. How do we build and grow this company? How do we build and grow our communities, creating jobs and revenue? That was the call of the past. How do we do things more efficiently, better, and faster for less money? And as time went by, yesterday, if we were just to look back at leadership of yesterday, profits and productivity are still really important, but also the well being of people, the mental, emotional, physical well being of people really began to take charge in the last 40 years, 40 to 50 years. And so it was blending profits and productivity with the well being of people. We call that yesterday's leadership. The leadership that is needed today, because tomorrow is too late, later is too late. The leadership that is needed today is profits and productivity plus the well being of people and the well being of our planet. And it's this combination of these three that is the clarion call for conscious leaders. And the fact that you are here today says that you are one of those leaders. So we want to invite you into our vision. Our vision for this important work is to create a network of integrative leaders on the planet who have the capacity and the support to move from the aspiration to the inspired daily perspiration in creating that thrivable, sustainable future that Mark talked about earlier. So, you know who we are, why this work matters, what our vision is for it. So, let's dive in a little bit more to what exactly is integrative leadership.
Well, before we actually define or give you a conceptual idea of what integrative leadership is, we'd like to take you through some of the thinking and the hypotheses and foundations of the work that we've been doing together over the past couple of years by introducing you to the core elements of our integrative leadership model. And those core elements are divided into two categories. There's three core challenges and there's three levels of consciousness. And we'll explore each one of those together. But let's start with the core challenges. I think it was back in the 90s, I was reading a book by Freud that he published back in 1930, I think, called Civilization and Its Discontents. And I was really struck in that book by how he categorized the problems that we face as individuals into three buckets. The first bucket was self. And of course, self, body, mind, spirit. So we're all probably familiar with these. We have challenges that we have to face at the mental level, be it anxiety or depression, all the way through to schizophrenia or psychosis or whatever. Different ones of us are faced with different levels of challenge. In our body, we are faced with challenges of being healthy in our bodies, having good respiration, not being overweight, all the way through to the ravages of cancer. And then in terms of our spirit, I want to be clear that we're not talking religiously here at all when we talk about spirit. We're talking about the level of life-giving energy we have, the quality and quantity of life-giving energy that is coursing through us and expresses itself anywhere from being highly inspired and highly enthusiastic down to totally dispirited. So these are the challenges of the self, and we need to develop self-awareness, self-acceptance, self-management, and then beyond that, go through process of self-transformation to address those problems of self. The second bucket that Freud came across with was others. And here we're talking about people we interact with, either one-on-one in intimate relationships or friendships, through to people we interact with in systems and organizations, in teams, in communities. And here we're faced with challenges like navigating conflict, integrating seeming opposites and polarities. How do we harness diversity and create diversity and inclusion? How do we foster high-performing teams and high-performing organizations and the relationships we do there? The third bucket that Freud outlined was life. And by life, we mean everything non-human. It's how humans interact with everything non-human. So we're talking really here about the whole system ecosphere. How do we engage individually and collectively with our planet, generating a thriving, regenerative ecosphere? So how do we interact with the oceans, with the forests, with everything that isn't human? How do humans do that? So those are the three challenges: challenges of self, challenges of others, and challenges of life.
Yes, and we've separated them just to distinguish them from each other. But it's something important to acknowledge that none of these three buckets exist independent of each other. So it's not only self, it's self and others. And it's self, others, and life. They go together. And we are separating them out to define them and also to highlight that at certain times in our lives, one area is of greater focus than another, just based on what's happening in our environments, in our bodies, or even in our ecosphere. So if weather is happening and we're facing a disaster, we're all focused on whole system ecosphere. But if I'm feeling unwell in my body, my attention is going to be much more on myself. So one is not better than the other, but in order to focus on life, we also have to be thinking about self and others. So with that, I have a reflection. Think about these three leaders' challenges: self, others, and life. Which one is most pressing for you right now in this moment? Is it around yourself, mind, body, and spirit, others, people, systems, and organizations, or is it whole system ecosphere? There's no right or wrong place to be. It's just take a moment here to apply this to yourself. Now that you've had a chance to do that, let's take a look at the next three aspects that Mark mentioned earlier.
So the second three aspects are aspects of consciousness. And before we go further, I'd like to define consciousness as we are using it. Consciousness for us is the level or degree of clarity, of awareness and understanding that any one of us might have about a situation or a circumstance or a thing at any one time. So the higher your level of clarity, the greater your level of clarity, of awareness and understanding, the more conscious you are about a given circumstance or situation or system or whatever, the planet. The lower your level of clarity, of understanding and awareness, then the lower your consciousness. So that's how we're defining it. It's not a particularly spiritual or wishy-washy thing. It's really clarity of understanding and awareness. So every time we mention consciousness, think clarity of understanding and awareness. Now, we've identified three particular buckets and or types of consciousness, and we've identified these actually, it's not us that have identified them. We've borrowed from the work of Bob Anderson and Bill Adams in their book, Mastering Leadership, and which they mention a study by Notre Dame University called Stages of Adult Development or Stages of Development. And we've, in conversation with them, talked about this, and it's helped our understanding. So the first level is reactive consciousness. And here in reactive consciousness, what we're really experiencing is when we're born as children, we're these small, powerless individuals in a world surrounded by giants, and we have to learn how to navigate our way and get our needs met. So reactive consciousness is very much about how we create our own strategic survival mechanism, the unconscious operating system that drives us and that is formed when we are very young. And it's basically a mechanism for navigating the world that is self-protective. It tends to be fear-based, and it's created in an environment where the world is happening to me rather than I am powerful and creative in the world. The world is happening to me. It comes as a bunch of challenges and some opportunities. But how do I react? And so this is the unconscious strategic survival mechanism that we all develop and we all carry and lives and stays with us forever. The only question is how powerful and how deterministic is it? As we mature, then we begin to generate what we call a creative consciousness. Here we are able to create some space between our knee-jerk reactive internal sensations and having our behavior be generated immediately off that. We create some space and we begin to become aware and at choice. So we always have those internal reactions, but we don't necessarily have to act off them. We begin to develop some breathing space between them, and we begin to feel more powerful rather than at effect in the world. We become able to affect the world. And so as we become more powerful and we begin to realize that we can make creative choices, we can make choices for a vision or an outcome that is not predetermined, that we can actually generate and be powerful in the world, we experience a sense in this creative consciousness that my relationship to life has a lot more by me, a lot more generation by me, that I can choose a lot more how I interact with the world, and my awareness is commensurately larger. The third level that is identified in that book, Mastering Leadership, is integrated consciousness. They call it integral. We're calling it integrative, which is sort of integral informed by unitive in our view, unitive being the whole system. So this integrative consciousness is different than the other two in that it has a very great clarity in the whole system perspective. It's a much larger system perspective. And here there's also an alignment with the needs of that larger system. So it's listening for what life itself is calling for, not necessarily what we personally want, but what life is calling for and how do we put ourselves in service to that. So the sense of here is, how does life flow through me? How do I make myself a vehicle or channel for what life is calling for? I have a sort of a little image that I use where in reactive consciousness, if we were all faucets, if we were a reactive faucet, we would be trying to hold on to the water and make sure we got enough water for ourselves and was sparing in who we shared it with. If we were in creative consciousness as a creative faucet, we would actually think we were the source of the water. We wouldn't mind spending the water because it would be servicing whatever it is what we would want to do. Both of these are a little egocentric, a little self-centered, but there's certainly a more generosity and a greater flow of energy, a less constricted flow of energy in that creative consciousness as we imagine ourselves for a moment to be the source of it. When we're in integrative consciousness, we actually wake up to the fact that a faucet or a tap is just a faucet, and that we are actually the channel through which life energy itself flows. And we begin to realize that even though we do have the ability to react or respond or generate, and sometimes it's to me and sometimes it's by me, that actually what's really happening is it's all life through me. It's hard to stay in that consciousness all the time, but that's really, at some sense, if you look at it from a very big level perspective, that's what's happening. We were born, we didn't create ourselves. Energy, life came through us.
Mhm.
So those are the three levels of consciousness. Now, the studies that have been done that are quoted in Mastering Leadership indicate that leaders in business, generally 75% of leaders are generally most of the time in a reactive consciousness, 20% of most of the time in a creative consciousness, and only about 5% are in an integrative consciousness most of the time. And so our endeavor as we create a move towards increasing the number of integrative leaders is to move some of those creatives over to integrative to try to reach a tipping point among leaders that will help cascade that consciousness forward in throughout the whole business and into the world.
Yeah. And Mark, I think it's so important. We hear about consciousness all the time as if it's a place to arrive at. You're either there or you're not. And for us, this is a much more dynamic experience. Part of it could be where I'm at in my life stage, right? I might be in that really creative stage. I'm creating a family, I'm creating a job, I'm in that place, and maybe I've done the work to move out of reactive. But the moment something shifts in your life, maybe you get sick or, some new issue arises, as Mark talked about our body, we're going to drop right back into the reactive space. It is a natural and normal part. And the key, though, is as we mature in our consciousness, we become aware that, oh, I've gotten into this reactive place and that I now can move back to awareness and at choice. Doesn't always mean it's easy to do so because sometimes it's easy to just stay unconscious and in that reactive state. We don't even know the chaos we're creating. We're just in it. And so the key is, can we have the courage and the awareness to keep moving back toward creative? Because if we can stay awake and aware long enough and at choice and creative, we have these moments of truly being able to see how everything is connected. And that is that integrative consciousness. But it is dynamic. There is no place to arrive to, and there's no judgment because we can all move up and down this continuum in a heartbeat. And so, on that note, we're curious about you. Think about just the last week as a leader. If you were to pull back and take a 10,000 foot view, look at yourself and how you were engaging with the challenge you identified earlier around self, others, and life. Think for just a moment. What level of consciousness were you predominantly operating from in relation to that challenge? Reactive, unconscious and automatic, creative, aware and at choice, or integrative, conscious and embodied. No judgment here, just identify in relation to the challenge, what level of consciousness were you operating from? So now that you've identified those two things, I want to take a double click and Mark's going to tell you why consciousness matters.
Well, why does consciousness matter? Well, consciousness is, we believe, at the root of all things. Consciousness, that our level of clarity, of awareness, and of understanding is the bucket or the container within which our intentions come forward. And our intentions inform our behavior, and our behavior creates impact for ourselves, for others, and in the world, in life. So it's really important that we work with our consciousness and that we try to develop and expand our consciousness, because it's very easy to get trapped in a self-fulfilling prophecy or a self-fulfilling cycle and an endless loop of, for instance, if we're in a reactive consciousness where our intentions and our behaviors and our impact all feed back on each other and reinforce each other in a loop that makes it incredibly hard for us to break out into a new way of seeing things. So that's the challenge. And that's why consciousness matters, because consciousness creates impact. And if we look at our lives, sometimes we're pleased with that impact. If we look at the big picture and the direction we're going, some of us are probably pleased with the impact, but others maybe not so much. And if you're listening to this and you're with us here today, then we're thinking you're probably thinking the impact and the way it's going is probably not where we intend to be.
Yeah. And so think about yourself as a leader. You identified a current challenge that's most pressing for you right now, and you identified the level of consciousness that you were bringing to that. So, just that alone, taking time to check in, is what allows us to increase our level of consciousness, to be more aware, and that puts us back at choice. And again, as Mark said, the fact that you're here and you're listening in on this says that you want to be a more conscious leader. Um, and I think that that is the aspiration of reaching toward the behavior, toward the action, toward the perspiration of actually creating the outcomes we desire. And so let's bring those two aspects together, the challenges and the consciousness, and loop it together into the integrative leadership model.
So we have 3 levels of consciousness, and we have 3 challenges. So we've got a 3 by 3 matrix here that we're going to be working our way through. And so let's start first with reactive consciousness. What does reactive consciousness look like in relation to self, others, and life? Well, we've spent a fair amount of time talking about reactive consciousness at the level of the self, and this is our automatic strategic survival mechanism, our invisible operating system, which dictates most of our choices and actions, unless we are really taking a chance to step back and think about it. So this is a very self-centered, fear-based way of being in the world. In terms of reactive and others, our early training, you may remember your early training is very often all about moving to the top of the class, being first, getting the medals, beating the competition. It's a very competitive win-lose sort of, I would say, faux Darwinian. Uh, what's that Darwinian phrase? I've lost it for a moment. I'm having a senior moment. Oh, survival of the
It's
fittest.
okay.
That's right.
Yes.
Survival of the fittest. Thanks, Gretchen. So we're in the survival of the fittest, beat the competition relationship with others a lot of the time. It's often very, very competitive, win lose, trying to look good. Um, so that's how we are in the reactive others. In terms of life, how do reactive human beings, relate to everything non-human, to the ecosphere, the whole ecosphere? Well, historically, it's been a very linear, extractive relationship. Essentially, the planet has been a global piñata that we can keep whacking until all the goodies come out of it. And we see all sorts of signs of that all over the place, with deforestation, depleted fisheries, ocean acidification. I won't go on because we might get depressed. But we
No,
can
we don't
see
want that.
that there's a very, very linear ignoring of the
Hmm.
cycles and circularity of nature itself. So
Yeah.
so that's how we
Mhm.
are at the life level.
Yeah, and just on that note, when we think about that reactive level with self, others, and life, it is a loop that one can get caught in, right? Like I'm at this win lose and I get stuck there and centered on myself. And it's really hard to even think about the impact I'm having on my planet. And so if somebody gets something that I don't have, I've whacked the pinata, but nothing came out because someone else did it. I'm going to stay in that self-centered, you got something, so I lost, or the other way. And this loop in the reactive, people tend to get stuck in it. It's part of the human experience. And so just noting that that is very, very human to be in the reactive, and it speaks to where we spend 75% of our consciousness. And as we transition this back to leaders, this is where we start linking it back to profits. And this is the type of leadership that's focused on profits and productivity, and we would call that economic intelligence. That is the motivator and the level of consciousness the leader is bringing.
And hopefully, when we get to be in our creative consciousness phases, we behave differently, and we do behave differently. Again, we've explained a lot in terms of the level of self when we were looking at what is creative consciousness. But here in creative consciousness, we are able to be aware and at choice. There's much more capacity to self-manage. We're much more grounded. We're not being tossed about by the vagaries of life and our knee-jerk reactions to it. We're able to actually step back and make choice. It's not easy work, as Gretchen has said earlier, but it is work that, when done, makes this available to us, that we can be far more grounded in the face of the challenges of life and the challenges that we're facing at the self level. In terms of creative and others, There's an interesting phrase that a consultant called Ichakadizes was the first person I heard it from. It's called co-opetition. So in relationship to others, we're in, I would say, a limited cooperative situation inside of um, a container of competition. And we're looking for win-wins in this kind of situation. So we've gone from very distinct in-groups and out-groups to sort of flexible boundaries on our in-group and out-group. Sometimes someone's in our in-group, sometimes they're in our out-group. And to give you a very practical example of that, if you think about the level of competition at the market level that happens between the US and China, the two of the biggest economies in the world constantly competing, and yet there are areas of cooperation. And most recently, in November of 2023, President Xi and President Biden decided that they would reconvene and or let go come together again the working group on climate cooperation. So here's a small area inside the bigger competitive area where it really behooves both parties to cooperate. Another example of that on the level of businesses would be back, oh, this is just back before the crash, actually. In 2008, UPS and DHL, who both ship packages around the world, decided to work together. DHL came to UPS and they didn't have a distribution system in the States, so they asked UPS if they could use their planes. And now, why would UPS let the competitor use its planes? Well, in that moment, it was either UPS or FedEx. And so UPS didn't want FedEx to get all that extra business, so they went into a cooperation with DHL, as I understand the story to be. So here's a limited competition. They were still competitors in the big field, but here was a co-opetition situation, cooperation inside competition. So in that creative and others, we're looking at co-opetition and win-win. In terms of the level of life, our relationship to the planet is what I would call provisional, what we would call provisional. And provisional is really defined as serves for the time being. So it's a very sort of circumstantial, transactional kind of relationship, but very creative in some ways. And so it's provisional and I would say compensatory. And by that, I mean, an example would be like, okay, can I continue to pollute the planet as long as I have you pay for you to plant trees? Uh, let's create a carbon offset market so that people can try to do that. So some very creative ways of thinking of how we continue to be the way we want to be and have someone else do the work for compensating for that. And sometimes that leads to some really bad actors, things like Volkswagen um, fixing their emissions tests and pretending that they're actually combining. So that would be greenwashing. So greenwashing can appear up here too. In terms of the development of business itself, this is, and Gretchen had referred to this earlier about how we've moved from a straight economic intelligence to an economic and emotional intelligence. People are becoming important here. It's becoming a competitive advantage to have a wonderful workplace. Glassdoor comes up and gives you a chance to vote on how wonderful your workplace is for yourself as a human being. So here we're looking profits and people, integrating those two. We've got economic intelligence, emotional intelligence. Over in
Mark,
yes, go ahead.
that brings up something as you're talking. I'm thinking a lot right now about how there's been a heavy focus on profits and people really over the last heavy focus over the last 10, 15 years. What are the perks? What are the bonuses? Let's make sure people are well taken care of, work-life balance, all of that. Then the pandemic hit and people were working from home, still putting people first, all of those things were important. But now there's this push for return to the office. Right. And it's creating some real tension in the workplace because what's happening at a leadership level, there's a return back to reactivity, which is focusing on profits. Well, we're paying for this overhead. I need to make sure that I know that people are being productive. If I can't see them, they're not working. So you can start to see how even if an organization or even at a societal level in leadership, if we're moving this way, have one thing, a pandemic, a significant thing happen, and all of a sudden there's a pushback toward the reactive. And then equally, you see people moving back to that self-protective reactive space as well, which is why organizations and leaders matter because they impact the ecosystems that they are part of. And so again, just thinking about these examples of that loop that can happen between creative and reactive, and 95% of leadership decisions and behavior is made in those two places. And we see that happening right now, real time example. And so the invitation is, what would happen if we could be more conscious and not get stuck in that loop?
Right. What could happen if we had a more integrative awareness?
Mm,
And so we talked a little bit about what is integrative awareness at the self level. And really, when we're talking about this being conscious and embodied, life flowing through us rather than us being the source of life, understanding this whole system perspective, there's really a move, I think, towards not self management so much, but self transformation. How do we actually get underneath the strategic survival mechanism and get back to and get access to what I would say is who we originally are? And I'm going to speak perhaps a little softly for the business world here, but my experience is that at our core, beings are, unless they're damaged in some way or caught in a reactive consciousness, beings are truly at core loving beings. And so it's really how do we work and do the self transformational work that allows us to become a servant to what is called for and expressing who we truly are in our core essence, which is not fear bound, although that is part of the human experience, but is, in my view, more love generated. So, how do we do that? How do we move from self centered to the centered self, the self transforming self? In terms of integrative and the others, which is the challenge bucket, the middle challenge bucket, here we're much more in a much more relational, co creational, symbiotic relationship. If you actually look at nature, it isn't really as much survival of the fittest as it is those that cooperate well and collaborate well survive. This might be interesting for you to know, but a number of microorganisms in the human being that live in and with the human being outnumber human cells about 10 to 1. And there's actually microbes that are responsible for 95% of the serotonin that makes you feel good. It's not your human cells. So there's a sort of a very personal level of cooperation. But if you look at nature, it's the parts of nature that have learned to work well together. It's the organizations that work well together with other organizations and do co-creative relationships. So you see Amazon Web Services all the time naming their partners of the year and their best partners, which is a little bit sort of in the win-lose sort of thing, who's the best one. But what it indicates is that they are constantly in this web of partnership with people. And that is increasingly a way that businesses are operating with each other. In terms of integrative in life, here we really have this whole system perspective, this whole ecosphere perspective, seeing the planet as a living thing. There's this whole thing called Gaia, which some of you may be familiar with. And what we understand here at the life level is that it's cyclical and circular and needs to be regenerative. Life regenerates itself. If we would align ourselves with the laws of nature, we would see that if we stop doing destructive things, that nature itself revives itself and thrives. And so there's a chance for us to really allow ourselves to be in that consciousness where we sort of see the whole world as one family, both the human parts and the non-human parts. And here, the call, and we said it was the clarion call earlier in this group, and Gretchen was talking, she called it the clarion call of today, is we're really looking at how do we integrate people, profits, and the planet, or profits, people, and the planet. How do we use our economic intelligence, our emotional intelligence, and add to that a real ecological intelligence to be in touch with the fact that we are part of a living ecology, and that needs to be part of the equation too. So
And
those
and
are the
it
9 elements. Sorry, just let me say. So those are the
yeah.
9 elements. If you think of a 3 by 3, reactive, creative, integrative on the horizontal, and self, others, and life on the vertical, and that gives you 9 boxes, which we've just talked our way through. Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
Greg, interrupted you.
No, it's great. It's like I just want to keep reiterating that this is a dynamic model. No place is better than the other. It's just how much time are you spending in any quadrant and what is the impact of that? So again, like As I mentioned, we could have an organization that's very focused on win-win co-opetition, and then something shifts in the market and it can shift right back to win-lose, right? So there are so many ways that this model is important, and it can change in a moment, but also, as we progress in this model and we understand it and we have this level of awareness, we begin to be aware of where we might be in some of those reactive spaces and how to begin to move ourselves forward. That's where we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. So thank you so much, Mark, for bringing this model to life and linking it back to the why of our work.
Just one last thought I can have there, if I may, Gretchen.
Yeah,
You
jump in.
notice in the model that the bottom line is self, self, others, and life. The bottom line is self. And it's absolutely true what Gretchen has been saying about this is a very fluid model. We occupy all different parts of it all the time. But part of the thing that we need to understand, I think, is that we need to do the self work that allows us to actually have the capability to move between these things, because it's not necessarily automatic that we move between those things. So there's some self-transformational work, some self-awareness work, some self-development that needs to happen so that we have the capacity to move from these places, because we do. And as we've seen from where the percentages are, um, not everyone has the capacity. People exist at different levels of maturity, different stages of development. So I think that's the important thing to underline. An important thing to underline here is that it all starts in terms of our relationship to others and life. It all starts with our willingness to look at ourselves and do the self work. That is the basis.
Yes, 100%, especially as leaders, because, when we think about servant leadership, I think many leaders have taken that to mean I sacrifice myself in the greater good of the whole. But there is a concept that I use a lot with leaders that I'm coaching and working with, which is you have to be selfish in order to be selfless. You've got to take care of yourself, because if you're depleted, if you're empty, if you're doing that, you're going to move into the reactive mode, and then you can't be in service of others. You can't be in service of life or your organization or your family. And so, as Mark said, the work always comes back to self first, because it's self first, then self and others, and then self, others, and life. It is a progressive model. And so, again, why does this matter? Profits, people, and planet, as we talked about earlier, later is too late. Now is the time. And so the question becomes, how can we actually identify where we are on the model, where others are, and on a regular basis in order to create a level of consciousness and awareness around this? So the first thing I'm going to say is, with reactive leadership, pretty easy to see. In fact, when I say think of a reactive leader, I bet someone just popped right in your mind right now. They're very easy to identify. Just take a look at how they're engaging with themselves, others, and life. And you can see the ripples out of that in their ecosystems, in their family lives, and even in their physical bodies, right? It's pretty easy to see a reactive leader. But when we're talking about creative and integrative, it's a little harder to distinguish from the outside. So we have to take a deeper look, and we have to take a deeper look over a period of time. So earlier we introduced you to the model. So I have an experimental formula that Mark and I have been playing with, which is, what if you take your dominant challenge you're dealing with as a leader right now, self, others, and life, and you combine that with the level of consciousness that you're bringing to that challenge. And from there, you can match those up to identify the type of leadership that you, your organization, your team is operating from. So if we see that an organization or yourself is focused on the others level, from a reactive place, it's going to be win lose, right? If that other company is doing well, our company must be suffering. If that person got promoted, I am obviously losing, right? Like, so we start to see where we, the organization, or even a team is, right? You can see that. Or even in our complexity of the workplace today, there's so many matrix teams. What would happen if you had a matrix team that was coming from a creative place focused on others? They'd be in that win-win place. So this is the model. Now, this is a formula that you can take a look at. I want to bring it to life by sharing a personal example of leadership. And for myself in 2021, I was caught in that reactive loop that Mark talked about earlier. I didn't have great relationships with my peers. I was feeling unwell in my physical body. It was coming out of the pandemic and I was doing what most leaders were doing, which was burning the candle at both ends. My relationships were suffering. And some days I didn't even get out of the house or my pajamas or even open the blinds, right? Like I was in this reactive loop and I stayed there for well over a year until I had a catalyst moment. Two things happened. The first is I received a serious medical diagnosis. On top of that, I also did the leadership circle profile and got feedback from people in my environment. And let me just tell you, that woke me up. I realized in that moment that I was in this loop. And then I was now aware, which put me in a position of choice. Am I willing to do the hard work necessary in order to get out of that loop? Or am I going to close my eyes, go back to sleep, and get caught in that reactive loop? The risks physically in my health and in my career and in my relationships were too great. So I did the hard work of focusing on myself. In fact, I called it my adult gap year. I left my house and my husband and my job in 2021. And in 2022, I woke up January 1st. I was in Arizona and I said, I'm going to put myself first for the year. I'm going to be my own best friend. I'm going to take care of my physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well being within myself so that I can be in service of my bigger purpose. And it was hard to make that decision, but I will tell you the capacity that I grew in that year has really fueled the huge transformation in my life. And that's not to say that something else couldn't happen and I wouldn't go back to being reactive, but the difference now is that I am more likely to get more quickly back into that creative space. So this is my own example of how this model would show up. And so think about yourself, the dominant challenge you identified earlier, the level of consciousness that you're bringing to it, that is the type of leadership you are currently operating from. So, again, think about self, others in life, your dominant challenge, level of consciousness, reactive, creative, and integrative, and plot yourself on this map.
Wow. So, having plotted yourself on the map, you're looking at the type of leadership you are operating from today, or in that particular combination of consciousness and challenge that you were talking about. And what I'd like to do is to give you a chance to really think about what type of leadership do you want to be operating from, and what is the impact that you would like it to have. So, we're going to give you a chance to share together about that, and off you go.
Yeah. And so just thinking again, like if you're coming from the automatic place, what would it be like to shift to self-managing? So it doesn't have to be from automatic if you're in self and reactive to self-transforming. Maybe there's a segue in between. So again, as you're thinking about this for yourself and applying it, I think the next thing that becomes important is, okay, we're starting to identify where we are. I think the next natural question is, how can we consistently identify where we are and those we work with, the teams that we're part of, and the organizations that we're part of. And so, on that note, we've given you one piece of this model, which is the integrative leadership model, right? First step, identify the challenge. Second step, identify the level of consciousness you're bringing to it. That is phase one. The next phase is to take it even deeper by bringing in a diagnostic tool. The leadership circle profile is the one that we've aligned with because it measures both reactive and creative. And so that really helps us begin to identify where we are. The second step on that is leaders then get a 360-degree feedback loop so that they can start to think about how not only do I think I'm showing up, but how do others experience me? The difference between intent and impact. And so when we start to look at this, leaders get feedback, which helps them increase their level of awareness, which then puts them at choice. The really powerful thing about the leadership circle profiles, in addition to assessing creative and reactive, it also has validated indicators of integrative leadership. And so there are some specific areas that are directly correlated, creative competencies to integrative leadership, and there are two that are inversely correlated to integrative leadership. And Mark is going to share a little bit more about that now, especially given some of his conversations he's had with the founder of Leadership Circle Profile.
Yes, thanks, Gretchen. So we're not going into detail on the profile here, but there are 6 pieces that I want to call out. Out of my conversations with Bob Anderson, I was talking to him and saying, you've created this incredible tool that lets us determine reactive from creative. It gives us the shape in the reactive of what our strategic survival mechanism is, what the components of that are. And I was talking to him about saying, look, if I was to look at this, how would I identify integrals? And I began to say, here's how I would do it. And he said, oh, that reminds me, I actually ran an algorithm years ago. I'd forgotten about it. That I found 6 elements inside the TLC profile that indicate that the chances are that this is, or not the chances are, that indicate that these are the people who are probably integratives and who have that integrative consciousness. And those 6 things were the following. The 4 that were positively correlated with that was purposeful and visionary. Now, this wasn't a personal vision, that's more in the creative realm. This was a vision for serving what life is calling for. So being purposeful and visionary, consistently communicating and modeling a commitment to the purpose and vision as you listen for what life is calling for. A second element in the profile was community concern. Here, having a service orientation that leads to a legacy of community and global welfare. A third was mentoring and developing, being willing to pass on to the next generation the benefit of your own learning and wisdom. So proactively developing others through mentoring and growth enhancing relationships. And the 4th element, which is actually the fundamental element, was being a personal learner. This is looking at self again. Being able to demonstrate a strong interest in learning, actively pursuing professional development, and key here, and personal self-transformation. Being in that game of looking at oneself, not that game, that activity, that life-giving activity of stepping away from reactive into what life is calling for, into the self-transform. So those were all positively correlated. The 2 things that were negatively correlated that leaders sometimes evince, often evince, were personal ambition, being overly self-centered and competitive and needing to personally get ahead at the cost of others. That was a negative indicator for integrative leadership and integrative consciousness. The second one was conservative, being overly risk avoidant, thinking and behaving in a way that blindly follows procedures, never coloring outside the lines, staying inside the box, inside the prescribed rules and norms, never breaking out into bigger and larger awareness and understanding of the world. So being overly conservative, being personally overly ambitious, these were negatively correlated with integrative leadership. And we can identify people's scores on that TLC profile.
Yeah, and not only can we look at where an individual leader is, there's also the collective leadership circle profile that you can look at a team or a board of directors or a senior team or even a whole organization of leaders to identify where are leaders, a team, an organization on this integrative leadership model. One of the things I think is really important is that ambition and conservative are not negative. There are gifts to it. The key, though, is the self management. And Mark talked about the overly aspect of these. And remember, when we go into reactive, that self automatic mechanism, any of us could fall into these. And so I want to invite each of you to build on this work we've started today with the integrative leadership model and to download the free integrative leadership guide, which includes a link to be able to complete a self assessment. It's not a full 360-degree assessment, but is a free assessment that you can get through the Leadership Circle profile to begin to see where you might be today. You know, where are you today? Because remember, it's that level of awareness that puts us back at choice and invites us back into the creativity. And from that creative space, that's where we start to move into the more integrative, which is what's called for now. So I want to invite you into the experiment, right? You showed up today. There's a reason for that. You're still listening. There's a reason for that. And so we want to invite you in and really bring this model to life. And you can do that a few ways. The first is we wanted to open up just 12 seats in becoming an integrative leader. It is a 2-hour online experiential workshop that will allow you to take a deeper dive into understanding and applying the integrative leadership model to your leadership approach. And you're going to get to do this in relationship with other conscious leaders. It's $50 investment and it will be on February 15th. There will be a link to sign up. If we do have more interest than we have capacity, because we do want this to be an intimate, connected experience, we will absolutely consider opening up another one of these workshops. For people that have completed Becoming an Integrative Leader, which is Experiment 1, they'll be invited into Experiment 2, which is a 9-week online cohort-based coaching experience. This immersive experience will support you in becoming a measurably more integrative leader while developing those deeper relationships with conscious leaders. You'll have a full leadership circle profile, full 360-degree feedback, one-on-one coaching with Mark and I. In addition, you'll also receive peer coaching, which I think is invaluable from other leaders that are faced with the same challenges you are. Again, we'll only have 12 seats in that. It's a 9-week experience and the investment is $14.50. And we'll be launching that in March, mid-March. So something to sign up for. And then for leaders that have completed the first and the second experiment, we're going to have a third, and that is the Integrative Leader Immersion. It's a 6-month based cohort experience that begins with an integrative leadership retreat, followed by 6 months of online cohort based coaching. This will help to challenge and champion you to step more fully into integrative leadership while you're also engaging with life, while you're engaging with others, while you're engaging with yourself. This gives you the support and the tools needed to truly become a more integrative leader. And because this is experimental work in so many different ways, it's you who brings it to life. If you are doing similar types of work, if you're interested in having one on one conversations with Mark about your own consciousness journey, the ideas that you're up to, you want to collaborate, play, or just connect, we want to connect with you. And our contact information is on the screen. And again, we'll include that in the recording because Mark and I can't do this alone, right, Mark?
Absolutely not. And you said if you want to have more conversations with Mark and or Gretchen, I would say that's why both the informations are there. So either one of us that you resonate with would be great. So the time for integrative leadership is now because, as we've said several times, later is too late. So we want to thank you for coming to this and joining us in our vision of creating a network of integrative leaders on the planet with the capacity to not only move from an inspired place, but actually to perspire in that movement of
Mm,
inspiration to change the planet in some way, to make a
yes.
sustainable future, a thriving, sustainable future. So I think that brings us to the end, does it
Yeah.
not, Gretchen? So
Yeah. I,
yeah,
I
thank
can't
you
help
so
but
much
think.
for showing up.
Yeah, and I can't help but think, let's perspire together because it's not fun to do this work on our own. And when we are with each other and walking this path and sharing, and not a even cooperative way, but really in that symbiotic way. It's like 1 and 1 equals 1,000. So let's play together. Let's have fun. Come hang out with us in the workshop and the coaching experience, and let's see what's wanting to unfold. Mark, thank you so much for engaging in this important work with me. It is a joy and an honor to be able to do our own work together, and to not have to do it alone. I appreciate you so much.
Well, you're more than welcome, and right back at you. And if you're listening to this, you will be getting a follow-up email from us. So sit tight, watch your mailboxes, and come and join the party. Thank you so much, Gretchen. Thank you, everyone who was listening.